So,
Patrick.
Phil, you were moving to the question of governance, in effect.
Well, governance and the notion of definite and enforceable conditions, terms, promises, pledges, whatever they are, and what it means, and how it can be achieved.
Because the possibility that the conservation measures, mitigation measures, would not match the plan's objective in order to justify water exports would then leave the question that the chair asks, who decides whether there is a scaling back, as your slide indicates?
Mm-hmm. So ultimately the process is, this is described in Chapter 6 in the plan amendment procedures. The process would be the permittees, those who hold the permits, must apply for an amended set of permits. And then they would be working directly with the federal and state wildlife agencies.
And if they did not apply to amend the permit, what remedy would the state or anyone else have?
The remedy is, again, the state and the federal agencies have the ability to suspend or revoke the permits either in part or in whole. That's the remedy.
As a unilateral action?
Correct, as their own, at their own discretion, yes.
And beyond that, a party that believed that those agencies were not acting swiftly enough or at all would have to pursue that in court?
Yes. I mean, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not the right person to be asking this, but yes, that's how it's typically done.
And does the council have any jurisdiction?
Chris, would you like me to answer this?
Yeah, great.
Well, I think that we've been struggling with an area of great importance to not only this council, but to BDCP as well. So when we talk about why we're even asking these questions, it's important because I think we're talking about post-incorporation of BDCP into the plan, into our Delta plan. So the reason we ask these questions, as you know, is because we want the BDCP to be successful, because it will be part of the Delta plan. It will be a major component of the Delta plan. And this council was established to govern the Delta plan to further the co-equal goals. So there is, given that, a provision in the Delta Reform Act that specifically talks about post-incorporation interaction with this council and the BDCP. It specifically says that we can provide comments, but that we can't change the permit conditions. I think that we recognize that, and at the same time, we want the whole thing to be successful. So if it comes into the plan, we want to make sure that there is insured funding, that the BDCP is going to work, and that it's going to work in coordination with all the other components of the Delta plan, which is a more comprehensive plan.
Well,
than just the BDCP.
So, Chris, in the future, if that was at issue, whether the plan was successfully being carried out, given the possibility that funding was not adequate for some part of it, what is your thought on the council's role?
Well, again, I think the council takes the big picture view on the success of the Delta plan in meeting the objectives that are laid out in the statute, which is, in a nutshell, furthering the co-equal goals. If BDCP is incorporated into the Delta plan, that's a huge part of the Delta Plan. And we have to steer the big ship, cognizant, recognizing that the legislature has already spoken with regard to changing or not changing actual permit conditions over which we don't have jurisdiction. So I think this presentation is entirely accurate, that the jurisdiction resides ultimately, I suppose, with the state and federal fisheries agencies as to whether or not they unilaterally want to pull the permit or change the permit or make waves to put pressure on various aspects, and irrespective of whether or not the permittees submit an application for a permit change or not. But I think
so 25 years from now, when we're still sitting here, and something went wrong, our job would be to try and help rectify it so that the plan, BDCP, is carried out successfully because it's part of the Delta Plan. Failing that, we would point out deficiencies or problems that show that it's unbalanced and draw the attention and the focus and perhaps the public's to the question, which then the authority would rely with the two fish agencies, one federal, one state. Is that correct?
That's my view, and I think that's accurate. I think that's what the legislature intended. And keep in mind, if this does play out, if BDCP is successful and is incorporated into the Delta Plan, in the context of the greater Delta Plan implementation, we're already talking with state and federal partners, re-engaging more heavily with the federal agencies. So the agencies that are actually participating in the and have been for 7 years in BDCP will be at the table when we're talking about implementation of the Delta Plan. But I think your job is to steer the big ship. BDCP is a portion of the Delta Plan if it's successfully incorporated. It's not the entire Delta Plan. But with regard to changing the actual permit conditions, I would agree with the presentation.
I would.
Did you agree with we asked the question and then he proceeded to answer it, which is fine. But what is your answer to the question that Mr. Johnson addressed?
I was going to give a non-legal answer, and that has to do with the role of adaptive management in the success of the conservation plan. There are a lot of questions about how some of the conservation measures will work, and there's going to need to be a lot of design and additional detailed planning work going forward to implement this plan. And we've been talking quite a bit with your science program staff about how to engage and involve the Stewardship Council science program. We don't see it as possible without very, very active involvement. So it's not a legal handle in any way, but it's going to be critical to the success of BDCP, I believe. And I think we'll have to have some additional interagency agreements to spell out how that will work. So it's not the legal answer, but I think as a practical matter, what do we do if we have or don't have money to do one thing is also related to the question of, do we really need to do this, or do we need to do something else? Do we need to do a little more here, a little less there? So there's going to be a lot of aspects of this that we're going to have to figure out as we go, and I think that the council needs to be involved in that through the science program and through your implementation committee, presumably. So I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Fiorini?
Dr. Zippen, you have a very calm demeanor and delivery. You're obviously well-versed in the subject. We appreciate that. And the calm delivery, I think, is very good for the kind of topic that you're dealing with going into the future. Help me put it in perspective in terms of the sources of funding available. How many urban and industrial customers will this ultimately serve, and how many acres of agricultural land will the project serve?
I'm the wrong person to answer that question.
Well, then maybe the
25 million and 1 million, roughly, something like that.
Okay.
25 million people and maybe 1 million acres.
That was my recollection. I'm going to go home now and try and put that in terms of acres across the board, and then do my farmer calculation to determine how much it's going to cost me per acre to build this out. So I'll get back to you with my results later on. There are currently 84 restoration projects underway in the Delta in some form or fashion. As those are successfully completed, does that reduce the obligation of BDCP? Or does it not reduce the scope of the restoration activity of BDCP?
Right. So, excellent question. The plan in Chapter 6 has a provision called interim conservation actions, and that's actually an allowance of the NCCP Act from the date the planning agreement was signed, which was several years ago, and any time after that, if a restoration project is built and that project is not otherwise obligated to mitigate for something else, if the intentions of that restoration project, the goals of that restoration project overlap with BDCP requirements, we do have the ability to essentially count that restoration project, and that's consistent with other plans.
And you'll recall, Mr. Freeney, in the hearing we had a couple of months ago on restoration actions in the Delta, many of the projects that we talked about are being undertaken to comply with the current biological opinions, the 8,000 acres of tidal marsh, and then the anticipated reoperation and modification of the Yolo bypass and the Fremont Weir. Those would be examples of things that are underway now that would contribute towards the BDCP's restoration targets.
I do recall that, but I'm a little slow, and so that's why I had to ask the question today.
Yeah. So there is work underway now that will be helpful.
Okay. All right. Other questions, members?
I think one of the things that this shows is partly the complexity of the implementation challenge, the variety of partners who are going to need to work together. We look at any of the big restoration actions that have occurred in the state, whether it's the protection of the redwoods or the conservation of mountain lands like Mount Diablo or other areas, the restoration of San Francisco Bay, all of these things, come and go with a bunch of fund sources, and progress accelerates sometimes and stalls out at others, and sometimes you end up with a little less than you hope, and sometimes you have a successes you never expected, so that the ongoing work of building a partnership, having strong partners at the table, is really one of the key things that through the implementation committee and then through the BDCP's implementation office will be so important. I think it also underscored to me something that you, Mr. Chairman, often say, that all of the participants in the Delta are always looking for guarantees. I think you say they want everything to be guaranteed for all time to all parties against any risk. And you see in this situation the challenge of doing that over the long timeline that we have to have.
I am actually, I was encouraged last year when the Governor and Secretary Salazar clarified the notion that there were no guarantees on levels of water delivery, and also said that science would inform both water exports and ecosystem activity. The thing that disturbs me about the assurance and guarantees is not that the ecosystem is at risk, because it's at risk today under the current law. It's that the magic of a solution depends upon both sides of the equation, water reliability and ecosystem, being equally at risk or equally benefited to make it work. And that's why the question of enforceability and predictability and timing of projects becomes crucially important. The conservation plan brings both of them together, but there is not a comparability of likelihood of completion as long as the financing questions are unanswered. And maybe I'm just seared by 30 years of financial ups and downs in the state economy and the national economy, but my experience has been that the availability of funds requires a fairly prudent judgment of what's going to be available on both sides of the equation and requires matching it up. And so for me, I agree with the general statement. You got to have trust on this issue. But trust is possible only if the risks are borne equally and only if the alternative solutions in the event of lack of success are real. The death penalty provisions that everyone talks about, you can shut us all down. That's I probably shouldn't, but I will. The Constitution of the United States calls for equal treatment and prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And California litigated for over 30 years health care for prisoners in the system who are constitutionally entitled to some level of health care. And our prison health care system is now under federal court receivership because the politics did not permit or encourage the spending of the money that everybody knew ought to be spent because, who cares about prisoners? Maybe they'll forget it. You can't have that situation in a BDCP, which is water reliability and substantial ecosystem restoration, and have it work. You just can't. It's asking the courts to do what they are not well set up to do. And it just seems to me this requires very high level attention and additional work.
I think the points that you're raising are really, really important. I think you'll see some partial answers in the new draft that we have not talked about today, but I wouldn't say that we've gotten the complete answer, and we still need to be talking about that and thinking about that. And I would just add that I think it's not just a matter of equal enforceability, but how incentives are structured and how the funding strategy is established. So you can do things by enforcing, and you can do things with incentives. Or you can do a combination. So I think that's something we need to look at further.
Okay. All right. Ms. Moon, Mr. Zippen, thank you very much. Hopefully we'll schedule another one of these after the documents are released and digested in some reasonable period of time. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, our expectation is when the documents are released, we'll be back with the next briefing, which would be about the impacts of the project on the Delta as a place, and so we could use that information to go back and look at some of those issues. We haven't yet discussed those.
Okay.
Thank you.